This is a production of Cornell University.
Well, thank you all for being here today. I'm excited to talk about what I've been doing the past 2 years. It's definitely flown by. So just as an introduction to this topic, Dawn mentioned that I had spent some time at the Birmingham Botanical Gardens and working in their native plant collection. I really developed some interests that were instrumental in developing this topic, public gardens addressing environmental issues through the use of native plants. So native plants have existed for millennia, have evolved with their environments, and have become increasingly popular in the cultivated landscape. For the purposes of this research, a native plant is one that occurs naturally in a particular region, state, ecosystem, and habit without direct or indirect human action. And to provide a context for this study, I am studying native plants in public gardens, which are living museums, mission-based institutions which maintain plant collections and plant records by a professional staff and are open to the public. The study of native plants are important to botanical gardens because they serve missions including displaying biodiversity, beauty, and history. So when I began this study, I started questioning why native plants were increasing in use. And one of my observations was that they were being used to address environmental issues such as food for wildlife, a reduction in the use of chemical pesticides, fertilizers, and water when planted in their natural habitats, preventing the spread of alien invasive plants, contributing to phytoremediation efforts, addressing climate change, and increasing ecosystem biodiversity. They also are valued for their aesthetic beauty and regional sense of place. My research objectives for this study are to understand how public gardens are using native plants throughout their gardens and program offerings, what the motivations are for doing so, and if they're addressing environmental issues. Native plants are supported by research, but I wanted to know what motivates public gardens for using them. So I chose 4 U.S. botanical gardens based on preliminary interviews, their prominence in the field, and their collections policies. I conducted 2 to 3 phone interviews to maintain consistency with leadership staff of each garden, including the executive director, director of horticulture, and director of education when applicable. These interviews were followed up by site visits if I had previously not visited the garden. And I conducted follow-up interviews based on the need in the writing process. So now I'm just going to go through each site. The first site was the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center, which is located in Austin, Texas, and it was created through the vision of Lady Bird Johnson and actress Helen Hayes. Their mission serves to focus their displays and education around native plants of the state of Texas. The second site is New England Wildflower Society's Living Museum Garden in the Woods. It was founded and designed by Will Curtis, and they display native plants of the New England region. Education at Garden in the Woods centers around engaging visitors to gain an interest in using native plants. The third site was the Bledel Reserve, located on Bainbridge Island, Washington. It was created through the inspiration of Prentice Bledel and his wife with the mission of providing a tranquil visitor experience. This series of landscapes spans over 150 acres and is picturesque of the Pacific Northwest. The final site was the Birmingham Botanical Gardens, which is unique to this study in that it offers a variety of collections for visitors to experience, including 2 gardens of nature, which focus on the display and education of native plants. The collections were made possible by donations of money and volunteer hours by key individuals. So now I'll tell you a little bit about what I found in the form of key themes, differences, challenges, successes, and practical implications from the study. So the first theme was the use of native plants throughout the gardens and program areas. As pictured here, native plants permeate throughout the education and displays at the Wildflower Center and at Garden in the Woods. While their styles vary at both of these gardens, teaching people to understand, appreciate, and use the regional native flora in a sustainable manner is central to the organizational goals. The use of native plants at the Bledel Reserve is focused on providing a tranquil experience. Currently, they do not have a formal education program. At the Birmingham Botanical Gardens, native plants are displayed in two areas, focusing on the biodiversity the state has to offer. The Barber, Alabama Woodlands displays mainly native trees and serves as the hub of native plant education for children. The Call Wildflower Garden was developed from an old stone quarry from the Works Progress Administration and is pictured here, and displays herbaceous native plants, placing a special focus on those of wild provenance in Alabama. While native plants are not central to their mission at the Birmingham Botanical Gardens, they do offer educational programming for all ages that encourages a deeper engagement with native plants. A second theme was the motivation behind the use of native plants. Key figures played a role in establishing each garden or collection within the garden in each case of this study. Beyond that, the key figures Lady Bird Johnson, Will Curtis, and Prentice Bledel, respectively at the Wildflower Center, Garden in the Woods, and the Bledel Reserve, were all influential in establishing a mission that was instrumental in determining the plant collections policies at these gardens. A third theme was the motivation for using native plants for environmental purposes. Each garden in this study emphasized using native plants for a conservation purpose, thus promoting an awareness, and in the case of the Wildflower Center and Garden in the Woods, the use and further conservation of native plants. Garden in the Woods further has a display of rare and endangered native plants. Gardens also display native plants in order to enhance the natural world so as to bridge visitors to it. A couple of examples are public gardens providing a place for visitors to see the effects of climate change on plants and to see solutions on how to address this issue. In the same way, they are using native plants in their natural habitats to illustrate the reduction of water and chemical inputs. Some collections at the Wildflower Center and Garden in the Woods specifically were established to address environmental issues through their research efforts. Research areas included native plant propagation, carbon sequestration with native grasses of Texas, green roof composition, alternative turf mixes, water runoff, and others. In the future, each garden in this study is increasing efforts to reduce their environmental impact. Another trend that arose in this study was the focus of reaching three specific audience groups: professionals in landscape architecture, architecture design and contracting, young families, and singles in their 20s and 30s. By creating various educational programs, workshops, and garden events towards these different groups, they hope to garner their interest and further their missions. There were two key differences between the gardens in this study. The first difference was the specific environmental issues that were addressed. Because each garden resides in a different climate zone in the U.S., each garden focuses on a different issue. For example, the Bledel Reserve in Washington State enjoys regular rainfall. However, they are continually focused on maintaining clean water sources. The Wildflower Center in Central Texas places a major focus on water conservation as they constantly face drought. Another major difference was in the educational programs offered. The Bledel Reserve was the only garden in the study lacking a formal education program, although they do offer informal programs such as walks and tours. Education is completely focused on native plants at the Wildflower Center and Garden in the Woods, and recently the Birmingham Botanical Gardens joined in efforts as all three of these gardens offer a native plant certificate program. These certificates are awarded to participants through their completion of required and elective courses, field trips, and volunteer service. Each garden also experienced exceptional success in various ways of using native plants. The three pictured here are ways that gardens are disseminating information on native plants. The Native Plant Database on the Wildflower Center's website is internationally accessed and in last year alone received 5 million hits. The recently launched Certificate in Native Plant Studies at the Birmingham Botanical Gardens has had an overwhelming success in that their response rate and that they have had to create more classroom space to meet the demand, and they have enjoyed an unexpected revenue generated. The recent launch of New England Wildflower Society's Go Botany program is a computer-based program that is used to facilitate education and displays in a variety of settings, and according to staff is in high demand. Success at the Bledel Reserve comes in the form of grant funding for restoration programs, which have continually increased over the past 2.5 years. Staff members also note the anecdotal feedback from visitors. Each garden also faces challenges that affect their displays and educational efforts of native plants. One of these is managing invasive plants. Today, $1.4 trillion, or 5% of the global economy, is spent managing invasive species. While historically public gardens may have played a role in bringing invasive plants in through plant exploration, they are recognizing their damaging effects and costs associated with them and are working to prevent their future developments. Other challenges included caring for a large space with limited staff and budgets, and overcoming the general lack of knowledge of the value and importance of native plants.
Just to be clear, Katie, Texas bluebonnets are not an invasive.
Yes, yes. That's a pretty picture to look at. Thank you for pointing that out. Using native plants in public gardens as presented in this study culminates into a group of practical implications. These are intended to build the success of other gardens' use of native plants and how they use them to address environmental issues. These include establishing expected outcomes in their use, using them in a way that continues the design of the garden, using their connection with animals to bring in younger audiences, using them throughout the collection instead of in individual collections, considering the environmental effects of the design process, and to look at other organizations for guides as creating successful displays and educational programs. I conducted this study to discover how public gardens are using native plants and if a main motivation is to address environmental issues. I found that these gardens are using native plants in diverse ways to not only address environmental issues, but also to demonstrate that their value goes beyond their positive environmental roles. These gardens are able to display their beauty, encouraging an understanding and appreciation of native plants, and thus furthering their use. So I'd like to acknowledge my committee and Cornell Plantations for funding and support throughout the process, and the other fellows in the program. Yes.
Katie, did any of the places you visited express a challenge of sourcing their native plants, such as propagating them or finding them from commercial suppliers? And how did they address that challenge?
No, they didn't, because all gardens have their own nurseries. It really didn't come up, but I think they're all. Some of them are wild collecting seeds, and no, it didn't come up in the interviews at all, actually. So I think they're trying to actually provide sources for people in their community that do have challenges with that. Yes,
Katie,
Don.
both the Bledel Reserve and the Birmingham Botanical Gardens, where it's a mixture of native plant displays and non-natives, are the horticulturists taking measures in the non-native displays to make sure that they're not introducing invasives that could migrate into the native displays?
I think that where that comes up is more at the Birmingham Botanical Gardens. The Barber, Alabama woodlands that I mentioned is probably 20 feet from their Japanese garden, and the Japanese garden does have invasive plants, so they are constantly trying to pull those out, and that is something that they just recognize as a challenge, and it's something that they have to do. At the Bledel Reserve, because everything grows so fast, invasives are always a major challenge, and the restoration programs that they are implementing are really helping to address that. Does that answer your question? Okay. Yeah.
Is there any external push for more use of native plants at public gardens, generally speaking? I know, like the Chicago Botanic Garden is involved in the native plant, like the Seeds for Success program and things like that. So did you get any response from the folks you interviewed about external pressure?
I think they're not sensing the pressure, but they are wanting to reach out. The groups, so these certificate programs that 3 of the gardens have, they are really trying to reach people in the industries like landscape architecture, to encourage green building practices and establishing plants in the correct habitats. So I think the pressure is more them reaching out to people, and they're not getting that from people outside. If that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes.
Are any of your gardens tracking growth in these plantings in the community?
So I think a lot of the gardens in the study have seen the growth, but they haven't specifically been tracking it, and that is something that I recommend for future research to really see what the impacts are in numbers.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.